Rabbi Goldschmidt, former Chief Rabbi of Moscow, President of the Conference of the European Rabbis, is a world-famous individual who should be a household name by you, and after today will be, in terms of being a Chief Rabbi who fights against rampant antisemitism around the world, and especially in Europe, and who in the world of Batei Din is world-famous. Rabbi Goldschmidt doesn't know me well, but I know him very well from his Sefer Shut Zikaron B'Sefer, the landmark Sefer that created a framework for all the Batei Din after the 90s to figure out who is Jewish coming out of Russia. And when they get a get, what is the guy's name? He comes over and he tells you his name is Vlad or Svetya. And you ask him, you mean Vladimir? Oh yeah, you're right. I didn't, yeah, how'd you know? Or Svetlana? How did you know my name is Svetlana? Because Rabbi Goldschmidt told me that when you say this, you really mean that. And that's how I know there is amazing Sefer Zikaron B'Sefer. Rabotai, you have a tremendous zechut. I remember vividly the 2 times I had it when I was your age, to have Rabbi Goldschmidt around, and now you have the zechut of being part of the Mesorah, to hear a tremendous Rav and Moreh Horah speak and share Torah with you. B'chabod harav. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the Rav, this beautiful introduction, which I hope I'm going to live up to one day. It's wonderful to be here again. I'm also would like to recognize here Rav Meir Goldschmidt, as well as Rabbi Bacon. I know from his mother was the dean of Stern College. My wife is a graduate of Stern College. So is my mother-in-law, my father-in-law, Zechaneh Levracha, my grandfather-in-law, Zechaneh Levracha. So our family has a great and long year ties to this wonderful institution, to Yeshivas Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan. I would like to try to share with you, looking at you all very young. By the way, when I came to Moscow, your age, and we had a visit of the Minister of Interior of Israel, Rabbi Yitzchak Peretz, who was, still is, the Chief Rabbi of Ra'anana. It was Parshat Toldot. He looked at me, I was not even 25 years old, and he says, this is what it says, V'rav ya'avod tza'ir, that a rabbi has to start his career when he's still young. But you should know that this is a problem. Youth is a problem which with time goes away. And it's solving itself. So when I was your age, I came to the Soviet Union, to Moscow. It was before the establishment of the Russian state. It was still the Soviet Union. The Gorbachev was in his last years. And actually everything was falling apart. And at that moment in history, as it happens many times, the Hashgacha Pratis, there was a connection between one of the most interesting individuals at that time in Israel, Harav Adin Steinsaltz, who was very friendly with the Prime Minister of Italy, Giulio Andreotti, who introduced him to the Vice President of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR. And they decided to establish the first yeshiva in the Soviet Union. And I came in as one of the Rosh Yeshivas in 1989. Long story, not going into details. Actually, Yeshiva University also had a representative. The yeshiva at that time was Professor David Berger, who was also Judge Tzvital, the Monastritzer Rebbe. So wonderful time. It was still the Soviet Union. Our students were the refuseniks, one of them, Zev Elkin, who is today a minister in the Israeli cabinet, and dozens of young people, Bali Tshuva, who started from nothing, and they were not scared to start up with the most frightful organization in the world, the KGB. And they decided to lead a life of Torah and mitzvos in the Soviet Union to the best of their ability, and it was our we were the first ones from the West who were in touch with them, and it was our task to teach. We didn't know how long this window is going to open in the Soviet Union. Maybe this window is going to close any time. And we decided we were going to use any minute in order to teach as much we can give, in order to recreate this bond between Am Yisrael and all those millions of Jews who lived back then in the Soviet Union. When I arrived in 1989 in September to the Soviet Union in Moscow, there were 1 million Jews there. And among the 1 million Jews, less than a dozen children knew the Aleph base. And the question is, how do you build Yiddishkeit from zero, from nothing? Now, here in America, at least, the people who are still far away, members of others' denomination, they know there's such a thing as a Jewish community. They know there's such a thing called a synagogue or a temple. We're coming to a place where the only thing people knew that they were Jewish. And being Jewish was not a positive experience, it was a negative experience. And I remember that my teacher, who also sent me to Russia, his name was Rabbi Moshe Soloveitchik Zatzal, who was the first cousin of the Rav, of the leader of this great institution. Yeah, I asked him once, you know, in order to re-establish Yiddishkeit here in the United States, you needed giants. You had the giants like Rav Soloveitchik, you had Rav Kotler, you have others. We, compared to those giants, were little midgets, we're nobodies. And Rav Moshe Soloveitchik at that moment told me, don't worry about it, because in the United States, people left Yiddishkeit on their own will. So it's much harder to bring them back. While in the Soviet Union, through communism, people were taken away from Yiddishkeit against their will, so it's going to be much easier to bring them back. And so it was. So just in order to share with you a story, it was right after Sukkot, it's getting cold, and we are getting, and not everyone was happy that we open up an yeshiva in the Soviet Union. Many communists and Orthodox communists were against it, the government, parts of the governments were against it. Gorbachev had a very big opposition inside the government, and one day the mayor of Moscow decided that this wonderful experience of creating a yeshiva in the Soviet Union this chapter should be closed. So, like it's done in the Soviet Union, winter, suddenly electricity stopped working. And then a few hours later, heating stopped working. And then a few hours later, also there was no hot water, there was no cold water. They tried to push us out. We lived in a dacha, in the vacation home of the mayor of Moscow in Kuntsevo, in the north of Moscow. And actually, it was very hard to be in touch with people outside of the Soviet Union. To get an international call through, you had to call up the operator a few hours and an order. So at that time, I was very young. I was your age, and there was a book given out by the Foreign Ministry of Russia of all the foreign correspondents and all the diplomats in Moscow at that time. And we started calling up diplomats, saying, listen, there's the only religious institution which exists here in the Soviet Union, and it's about to be closed by the authorities. I think there's a story here. And not everybody came, but then they called up the New York Times, so they didn't come. At the end, what was interesting, there was a visit planned by the Prime Minister of Canada. His name was Brian Mulroney. He died just a few months ago. And I said, when I called up the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, that you're going to have a story here because the Prime Minister will come visit the yeshiva. There's going to be nowhere to visit because the place is going to be shut down and closed down. After this phone call, they said, yes, we're coming right away in half an hour. Don't move away. We're coming with our cameras. We're making a story out of this. And within half an hour, believe it or not, the electricity went back on. the hot water went back on, and also the heating went back on. So this was the first brush of working with adversaries, with powers which are trying to stop you. And this was the story, of course, of rebuilding Yiddishkeit in the Soviet Union, and then when 2 years later the Soviet Union fell apart and we started schools, the question was, when we started schools, thousands of children wanted to join Jewish schools. The problem was there was nobody there to teach them. So what did we do? So we put an advertisement in Izvestia, which was the official Soviet newspaper of the parliament, that we're looking for teachers who are Jewish. And 70 people answered this ad, of which 50 were Jewish. And of those 50 people, we taught them the basics of what can be taught in schools, Aleph Beis, and then Ivrit, and history, and Torah, whatever. And what was interesting, that the teachers were always only one step ahead of their students, which means we taught the teachers the night before what they are going to teach their students the day after. Establishing kashrus was also not easy. There was one shoichet in Moscow. His name was Reb Motel Lifshitz. The books written about him, one of the Lamed Vav Tzadikim, was Lubavitcher Chassid. And he was a great man. And but you need, in order to have kosher meat, what do you need? Besides having a shoichet, you also need something more. You need a trever. You need a person who is going to take out all the fats which you're not allowed to chelev, which you're not allowed to eat. And the person who did this was in time of World War II. He was the head of it's called in Russian a Straf Battalion. It's a battalion of soldiers who were actually inmates, prison inmates and criminals, and they were allowed, like it's happening today in Russia as well. They were allowed, on the front, they were allowed, as I said, they're going to survive, so they will be allowed not to return to prison. So the head of this company was a trever. His name was Tobechkin, and he, because he was in the Soviet army, his Russian was very colorful, and which the shoichet was not so used to it. So when they got into a fight, Moscow had no kosher meat, because when the treber, the menake, and the shoichet didn't talk to each other, there was no kosher meat in Moscow. So back then, the Baltics was still part of the Soviet Union, and I was sent to Riga, the capital today, it's independent Latvia, to check. There was a shoichet there, his name was Yisrael Gurevich, but he was very old, and there was a rumor that his hands were trembling. And if the hands of a shoichet are trembling, the shechita is not kosher. So I was sent by 14 hours by train ride to find out if his hands were trembling. When I walked into the shul in the morning and he shook my hand was hurting for over 20 minutes, and I knew we wouldn't have a problem here. So establishing a community where there was no Yiddishkeit brings with it its own challenges, and we established a community with schools, with yeshivas, with kollalim, with kashrus, with everything. And however, you all know what happened almost 3 years ago when Putin decided to recreate the Soviet Empire and attack the Ukraine. And the problem was that we know it now, that it is possible to thrive in terms of a Jewish community in a place where there are basic freedoms, and countries which turn authoritarian and then totalitarian. I think we know about Iran and other communities, that there is actually no Jewish future. And when the war started, the government tried to force the religious leaders to support this war against Ukraine, based on a false narrative that the Ukrainians are Nazis, and they continue it, and the Russian army is the continuation of the Soviet army against the Nazis. I said that in no way can we, as spiritual leaders, support this narrative, this false narrative. And I left Russia, and I resigned, and I called on the Jews from Russia to leave. and more than 80%, more than 80,000 Jews left since the beginning of the war, left Russia to Israel. And I'm visiting many communities in my capacity as president of the Conference of European Rabbis. I was just in Athens last Sunday, and a person comes over to me, and he was the vice president of the community. He was working for the ECB, for the European Central Bank. He says, Rabbi, I would like to thank you. So what would I like to thank you for is that when you called on the Jews to leave Russia, my daughter lived in Moscow and she left Russia and she listened to you, and Baruch Hashem, she didn't stay there. So this was at the beginning of the war. But since the 7th of October, since last Simchat Torah, when we witnessed this great catastrophe in the south of Israel, and actually the 7th of October is the birthday of Vladimir Putin. You should know that. And this was a birthday present to Vladimir Putin. And Russia joined Iran, the axis of evil, against Israel. And we see also all the arms given to Hezbollah, and Assad was totally supported by Russia. I think that many Jews understand that, unfortunately, under today's political leadership in Russia, there is no future, and therefore it's better to go and live in Israel, of course, and to other places. I would like to also to address for a few moments the situation in Europe. We all hear about it. The first thing I would like to say about Europe is the following. We have over 1 million Jews in Europe. Unfortunately, because of the Russian-Ukrainian war, two major communities are getting destroyed. The Russian Jewish community and also the Ukrainian Jewish community. And many Ukrainian Jews have moved to Eastern Europe. We have a whole community from Odessa which moved to Bucharest, and we have thousands of Jews who moved to Poland, to Germany, to other places. And when the 7th of October happened, the attack against Israel, the biggest pogrom since the Holocaust, for Jews, we have, as you know, as here in the United States, we have frum Jews, we have traditional Jews, and we have Jews who are very secular. And many secular Jews in Europe always supported Israel, not because they were big Zionists, not because they were very Jewish. They supported Israel for one simple reason. Israel was their insurance policy. Insurance policy that, chas v'sholom, if antisemitism is going to get out of hand, they'll be able to run away to Israel. For many European Jews, this was the reason they supported hospitals, the IDF in Israel. And what happened on the 7th of October actually was that for many of those Jews, the insurance policy failed. They asked themselves, is Israel still a place to go? Is it still is it safer to live in Israel than it is to live in Europe? And what has happened actually, and people don't know that, is that the demonstrations in support of Hamas did not start the 8th of October, when Israel started to respond. The demonstrations in support of Hamas and those terrorists started the 7th of October, the same day, while Israel did not respond, which means it had nothing to do with the response of Israel. It had to do that we looked weak and we looked vulnerable. And Baruch Hashem, in the last few months, Israel looks much less vulnerable. We have witnessed miracles, nisim, in Israel. When we talk about what happened to Hezbollah, you know, nisim, bederech hateva, also nisim. Miracles which are happening within the realm of nature. You know, when nothing works, like on the 7th of October, when everything works, like with Hezbollah, it is actually a ness. And it returned to a large extent the feeling of European Jews that Israel is the best insurance policy for the Jewish people. However, I must say, according to statistics, 75% of European Jews are trying to hide that they're Jewish when they go in the public domain. If they have a yarmulke, if they have a Magen David, they're trying to hide they're being Jewish. This shows to what extent the problem of antisemitism all over, in the UK, in France, in Germany, is a major problem. But just to give you an example, last Hanukkah, we are in the Conference of European Rabbis, we give out every year, we give out the Lord Jacobovich Prize to a non-Jewish political leader who supported the Jewish community. So last year we decided to give it to the President of France, Macron, in the Élysée Palace. It was the first night of Hanukkah. I flew in, and we lit the candles in presence of a great part of the rabbinical corps in France, and the Jewish leadership in France, in the Élysée Palace with President Macron. The next day, in all the major newspapers in France, this was on the first page, Macron, with myself, with the chief rabbi of France, with Chaim Korsia there, an attack that in France there is since 1905, there have been laws which created space between church and state, and which is called in France laïcité, that state officials are not supposed to engage in religious practices in government premises. And Macron was attacked, and we were attacked of having this Hanukkah lighting in the Élysée Palace. But the next day was Friday. I was flying from Paris to Düsseldorf. I'm there. I'm also going to visit other communities for Shabbos. And next to me was sitting a French businessman in the plane, and he has all the newspapers with him. He starts the newspaper, looks at the newspaper, then looks at me. Says, "It's me." He says, "C'est vous? Is this you?" He says, "Yeah, it's me." So the person happened to be a French Catholic businessman. I asked him, "So what do you think of the criticism of Macron that he lit the Hanukkah candles in the Élysée Palace and breaking the tradition of laïcité in France?" So he says, "Rabbi, I want to tell you, I live in the 16th arrondissement, the 16th district of Paris, and I have many Jewish neighbors. And in front of every Jewish apartment, there is something, there's something, this Jewish thing. Yeah, we call it the mezuzah." He says, "And every day when I go to my apartment, I see that one less apartment has a mezuzah. People are taking off the mezuzahs." By the way, that's a question we ask as rabbis in Europe. Are you allowed to take off the mezuzah because you're afraid that the Uber driver or the Bolt driver who is an immigrant from the Middle East, is going to attack us? If you're allowed to, if yes, how to do it? So I see every day the one mezuzah less. It's not because people are moving out, it's because people are moving in. And I said, therefore, it was very important that the president of France did this lighting of the menorah in the most public place in France. So we live in a place where we have many challenges in Europe. Europe Jewry has many challenges, and but the good news is that kasher ya'aneh oto ken yirbe v'chen yifrot, that these challenging times of rising anti-Semitism brought many Jews back to Judaism, to the basics of, so you can be progressive, you can be this, you can be that, but at the end of the day, you're being safe or being not safe is dependent on can Jews walk freely in the streets or not. So I would like to finish with a thought. I'm very happy to see also my son, Rabbi Goldschmidt, who joined us from the Alt Neu Shul. We are a few days before the beginning of the festival of Hanukkah, the festival of miracles. And we know that into the introduction of the Siddur, Rabbi Yaakov Emden writes that the survival of the Jewish people is, throughout the generations in the whole world, is a bigger miracle than all the miracles which happened at the time when Jews left Egypt with Yetziat Mitzrayim and with Kriyat Yam Suf. And actually, Rav Shach, he said that this is what the pasuk says in Pasuk Kitisa. We learn this every fast day. Vayomer hinei onochi kores bris neged kol amcho es and flows. HaKadosh Baruch Hu promises miracles, asher lo nivru b'chol ha'oretz u'b'chol hagoyim, which never happened in the history of mankind among all the nations. V'ro chol ha'om asher ato bekir bo es ma'aseh Hashem, ki noro hu asher ani oseh imoch, and the whole world is going to see that God is with us. And in other words, Rav Shach said that what Rabbi Yaakov Emden says, that's the pshat in the pasuk over here, which we say. And we have lived through a tremendous tragedy on the 7th of October, Simchas Torah, 434 days ago. But in the last year, we have seen also great, with resilience and with the Gevurah of Am Yisrael on one hand and the Siyata D'Shmaya on the other hand, we have seen great miracles, and actually in front of us, the Middle East is changing. What has happened in Syria and what has happened in other countries, and even though that Israel was so isolated and is isolated in the world, we see the Yad Hashem, the hand of God, in our times, in human history, in human politics, and these days of miracles should really continue, should come back and continue. We should always be ready to hear good news, Yeshuot and Nachamot, and I wish you all understand you're all in your finals, so a lot of success, and B'ezrat Hashem, a lot of success. We should all grow to be great leaders, Talmidei Chachamim, of the Jewish people will be proud of. Thank you very much for listening to me. So if there are a few questions, we have time for questions? Can you speak up?
Okay. So, you currently live in Russia or no?
No.
No. Strong?
Yes.
Sorry.
That's the question?
No, I apologize.
Okay. Any other question?
It's not a question, it's more like a point. Like in my community, like I live by Brighton Beach, like near Brighton Beach, and I find it fascinating that most of the Jews there, they know they're Jewish, and the only thing they follow in a sense is to marry other Jews, which I think is really interesting. Like, there's a lot of people in Brighton Beach who, like, they're old, they have pictures of Stalin in their house, they have their apartments where I see Stalin. Yes, I'm Jewish, but then I only marry Jewish, and I think it's like, it's a good thing that one of the things that they keep is like one of the most important things is who will marry a Jew.
Yeah. I know about this. I know about Brighton Beach, but that they have Stalin's picture in their homes, that's something new to me. You know. So, but I once spoke to a whole group of students, Jewish students in Germany. They're all children and grandchildren of immigrants from the Soviet Union to Germany. I asked them, tell me, are you proud to be Jewish? He says, yes. So they ask the next question, can you tell me why you're proud to be Jewish? Most students could not answer this question. And this is a problem. This pride continues to a certain time, but how do you give over this pride without explanation to the next generation? Here, without Jewish education. When Yitzhak Rabin came for the first time to Moscow in 1994, there were no Jewish schools, just a beginning of establishment. I told that without the Jewish education, there's not going to be Jews, and without Jews, then there's not going to be Aliyah. Jewish education is the key for every community in the world. There's no other way around.
Have you seen a lasting impact on the Russian Jewish community around the world that was there, even for a short period of time that was in Russia?
I can tell you one thing, that according to statistics today, we're talking about the Russian Aliyah to Israel, there are more than 1 million Russian-speaking Jews in Israel. You know what they say, what is the second official language in Israel? It's Hebrew. So they say that in the second generation, 14% are Shomrei Mitzvot of Russian Olim to Israel. And of course, those the people who moved from Russia to Israel were the most Zionist, most Jewishly, had the greatest Jewish identity. The Jews who moved to the United States and the Jews who moved to Germany, these are had much less of a Jewish identity. And I'm much more afraid for the Russian Jews who moved to the United States than for the Russian Jews who moved to Israel.
How do you convince someone that was never exposed to Yiddishkeit that they should start taking on these mitzvot and start learning about the Yiddishkeit?
It's learning. It's Torah learning. You open up a Daf Gemara and start learning with the person. That's one way. And the other way is by inviting people for a Friday night dinner. And these are the best ways of doing it. Limud Torah and by showing what a Jewish family is supposed to look like.
How do you do it on such a large scale? Your Shabbat table is limited in size.
So, if I think you have here also as future rabbis, you're going to have programs. I think a rabbi has to make sure that he invites his congregants at least on a rotating basis. It's number one. Number two, you're not alone. You have teachers in the schools. You have shlichim. We started kolelim, and also at Kolel Torah Mitzion in Moscow, which was extremely successful. So eventually, you students and the people who are being influenced by you, they are the ones who do the work. And having here my son, Rav Benjamin, who is here, when he went to school, and he was the only religious kid in his Jewish day school, which is started by us. His being with those children also influenced those children, and it is by personal example where you have the most effect today. It's not by telling people what to do, it's by personal example.
What would the Rav say is the role of, let's say, Yidden who have the opportunity of living in America now, that weren't so affected or are somewhat affected by antisemitism, but not in the extent of Jews around in Europe or around the world? What would the role of, let's say, young adults be going forward? Yeah, young Jewish adults.
As Jews living in America today, I don't want to tell American Jews what to do. But you live in a place which is a superpower, which has the most influence over the world, even though this new administration is more concerned about making America great again than being the policeman of the world. However, with having this community having influence over the new administration, I think that the well-being of the Jewish community, and not only the well-being of Israel, is going to be very much tied to the extent the American administration, American government is going to be involved to make sure that Jews are not vilified, Jews are not being accused of genocide, Israeli prime ministers are not going to be arrested for war crimes. This is, and the influence which you as American Jews can have over your government cannot be underestimated.
What do you tell those Russian Jews that kind of lost faith in their insurance policy in Israel? How do you kind of get their faith back in Israel if they kind of feel like after October 7th they lost?
I don't think it's what I'm saying is going to make a difference. I think that fact that Israel today has been able to force Hezbollah to stop bombing Israel, the fact with God's help we're going to see soon at least some of the hostages coming back, and Syria's army has been destroyed, and let's hope that also with Iran soon we're going to see a regime change. I think this is going to be the best answer for those Jews.
I'm from England. What do you do when
We're not going to take it against you.
What do you do when the rabbis aren't necessarily so sure whether Israel maybe is committing a genocide or killing too many Palestinians? You hear different rhetoric in England. The rabbis aren't so sure. Sometimes maybe they are choshesh for the other side because every newspaper and suddenly there's a little bit subtle things. You won't hear a soldier mentioned in a shul in England. It's the hostages. We can talk about the hostages, but we can't talk about the soldiers. And there are maybe 3 Zionist rabbis in England, and they're all mashlichah.
You're 100% right that the accusation that Israel's leaders and Tzahal are dealing in a genocide and are committing war crimes is putting tremendous pressure on Jewish communities in Europe, especially, and especially England, where the community is more left-leaning in general.
The most left-leaning.
What?
I would say the most left-leaning.
Mostly left-leaning, much more than France, for example, right?
In the world,
So, I think that, but the UK jury has produced many leaders who have been very, very vocal. Just to mention, Natasha Hausdorff is one, and others, and the other guy, Elyon. The few people who are doing very well in explaining Israel's position, and whatever you accuse Israel of, actually, it's something which we see from our parsha, from Parshas Vayeshev, with Ashes Potiphar. That exactly, she takes a story and she changes it totally around. And this is what we see, they're using the Holocaust against us. They're using the genocide laws which were pushed through the United Nations. In order not to repeat the Holocaust, they're using against us. It is a false narrative. I'm not saying that I'm happy with civilians who are getting killed in Gaza. Every child is getting killed. It is a tragedy. We can also express our feelings to this, but to say that Israel is committing war crimes and that the fight in Gaza is unjustified, this is a narrative which if a person is prepared, can be defended on all levels still. Yeah.
My aunt left France because of the antisemitism there, and it's been getting worse and worse and worse, consistently for the past 20 years. Is there any hope for the French Jewish community, or is it ending?
So, by the way, I knew one of the victims of the attack, the anti-Semitic attack in Pittsburgh. What was the name of that synagogue? Tree of Life. Was a French Jew who moved away from Paris to Pittsburgh in order to run away from anti-Semitism. My cousin was the rabbi of the Orthodox shul over there in Pittsburgh, took care also of burying all the victims. What is happening in Europe today, politically, is that the question is who is organizing all those demonstrations in support of Hamas, in support. It's not grassroots, it's being organized. You can see by all those tents which come from the same place, from the same factory. I believe that it's being financed and organized by 2 countries, by Iran and by Russia. And the reason is very simple. They want to destabilize the political system in Europe. Why? In order that Europe should not support Ukraine. And how they're doing this? By having anti-Semitic attacks, which pushes people to vote for the far right. And this is exactly what happened in France. It's happening in Germany, it's happening in Holland, that people the voters say the regular parties the establishment parties cannot provide for our personal security, and we're going to vote for the far right. And what has happened, for example, in France with Marine Le Pen or with Geert Wilders in Holland, is the far right said, we are there to take care of the problems. We're going to send millions of immigrants from the Middle East back to their home countries. So this is exactly what is happening today in France, and we haven't seen the last chapter yet.
What are your thoughts on, so my mom is from Hungary, like she left Hungary during the 1990s after the Soviet Union died, collapsed. So she's one of the rare exceptions to the rule that a lot of Jews after World War II left Hungary and then she was trapped.
She left 1956?
1956, her
right.
grandmother and great-grandmother.
Right.
So I was wondering, like this about Hungary, I speak a little bit of Hungarian and so forth, but I was wondering, what are your thoughts on leaders who are close to Israel, protecting the Jewish community, like Viktor Orban, but are also like close to Putin?
Right. It's not a simple situation where Israel feels being supported just by the far right leaders like Viktor Orban or like Geert Wilders in Holland, or to some extent Marine Le Pen. When there was a big demonstration in Paris with 120,000 people demonstrating against anti-Semitism, Macron wasn't there, but Marine Le Pen was there. It's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag, and we as diaspora Jews, I think American Jews or European Jews, we have to be very careful, because in other words, what is happening? What is happening is that Jews always thought that the best protection for Jewish life is a democracy. These were the basic values on which the European Union was founded. But now, with all these demonstrations since the 7th of October, the biggest problem became personal security. So Jews said, also a lot of Jews in France, there's a suburb of Paris called Sarcelles, where 70% of the Jews voted for the far right, for Marine Le Pen. They said personal security is more important to us than democracy. This shows to what extent Jews are scared for their security. Okay, last two questions? Good.
What is the status of Jewry now in Russia? Is it safe for Jews to go there? Are there any little Jewish communities still there, or anything like that?
There are functioning Jewish communities. It's much less than it used to be before February 2022. Very low key, trying to keep very low key. Give you one example. In any Jewish community here in the United States or in Europe, you're going to see in shuls, in the pictures of the hostages, right? It's like you're going to see in a shul in Russia, you're not going to see the pictures of the hostages. Much low key. And there's a lot of also governmental anti-Semitism. Lavrov and also Zakharova, the speaker of the foreign ministry, and Putin himself, they use anti-Semitism to attack Zelensky, who is the Jewish president of Ukraine. So it is, there were pogroms in Russia, in the south, in the Caucasus last November. I'm afraid what might happen there, because it's one man who decides everything. Last question.
Does the Rove think that battles, like in the attacks that are going on in Europe, is that a fight that we should have, and like the Jewish people, especially those living there, and even those outside, should try to push back against the tide, push back against the anti-Semitism, or is it so dangerous and it's so hard there now that it's not worth it to say, just leave, go to America, go to Israel? Like, fight back, or should we just leave and go to a place that's better for ourselves?
I think that much of the attacks against Israel is also motivated by anti-Semitism. Just to mention the twice Pope Francis in the last few weeks made statements regarding the genocide of the Jews that the Jews are perpetrating. I believe that having Jewish communities in all those places, fighting it, is helping Israel. And because people thought that when Israel is going to be created, there is going to be no more anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, it's not true. Today, there's maybe even more anti-Semitism than 100 years ago. The difference is that 100 years ago, we were weak and we were isolated. And today, we were blessed by something the generation of our great-grandparents or great-grandparents didn't have, having the State of Israel. And we have to, wherever we see evil, we have to fight it. We see it in our parsha of Yaakov and Esav and Shechem. We have no choice. We have to fight it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Good.
Yeah.